As Elizabeth said, I'm David. Sorry for those of you who heard this yesterday. I'm the Director of Programmes and Strategy at Cause 4. We're a fundraising organisation. Predominantly, we work with charities and social enterprises right across the world, actually, but increasingly internationally. And we also deliver large-scale programmes delivered in partnership, usually, which topical today. The largest of those, and it's the bulk of my job really, is a programme called Arts Fundraising and Philanthropy. That is an Arts Council England funded sector support programme helping the cultural sector to fundraise more and better, and all the things that go with that in terms of governance and business planning and partnership working. And we deliver that as the lead partner along with the University of Leeds and the Arts Marketing Association. And we've just started advertising a new resilience programme for heritage organisations called Heritage Compass, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And again, we lead it in partnership with the Arts Marketing Association and a company called Creative United, who work across finance and social investment within the cultural sector. So I've been in post a couple of years here at Cause 4 now, and beforehand in the sector for about 12, 13 years in usually roles that involve income generation in some way, be that commercial or fundraising. And then prior to that, I was working in a private leisure club, so running gyms and things, which is a whole different beast, but very, very cutthroat salesy. So anyone wants to talk horrendous, pressuring sales targets, I'm always happy to have a sort of shared rant about that at some point. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about peer networking, first of all, in a digital environment and how to build relationships virtually. And then we'll move on to sort of, once you've networked and found some people, how you might then develop partnerships working in collaboration with people, and think about some ideas on how to form and maintain effective partnerships with the added pressure of it being digital and Zoom fatigue and all the challenges that we've all become accustomed to over the last 6 months or so. I think to start with networking and think about that a little bit, I mean, the motivation for networking often I think means different things to different people, and in the real world, the sort of event that you're going, and the real world as in the face-to-face world, the motivation I think for people to attend different types of events to network for different things. So a sort of trade show setup is a much more commercial reason perhaps to go and meet suppliers or meet collaborators that way. And then a sort of conference or training format, there's that sort of educational motivation for people to attend things. And where in the past, I mean, if you think of the evaluation of events and things that you've gone to where you meet people, and it might have asked sort of, was it a good session, and what did that mean to you? What is a good networking session is quite different, I think, now. So initially, I mean, we run quite a lot of these events, and you always get lots of comments, as I'm sure you all do, about catering and how good the wine was and that sort of thing. And really now, I think the reward for an individual taking part in networking virtually is much more based around the device that you're accessing the event on, the software that you have, the bandwidth that you have available, whether or not your cat is howling in the background or not. And so there's a lot of kind of social factors that people can't control from an events organizer point of view. I thought it was quite interesting. This slide is a not very well legible, sorry, but from a virtual event manager's blog. And it talks about for event organizers, what's the kind of most frustrating thing or the toughest thing at the moment. And the inability to match live engagement, of course, sits right at the top. And I sort of slightly want to throw that on its head for this session and think, well, do we need to try and match the same conditions as live partnerships and live networking? Or is it something different? And what are we going to tease out, and what are we going to think about in terms of how, as we talked a little bit yesterday in terms of fundraising sense, about controlling the controllables and not worrying about controlling the uncontrollables. So we are where we are. Let's see how we can make digital as effective as possible rather than trying to make it like the real world, because it's not, it's different. Although I'm happy to push back on that if anybody feels that it should be. So as a general kind of show of hands, who would say they like networking and they network well? Okay, half and half. there's a lot of sort of different maybes happening. I'm not a very natural networker unless I'm being paid to do it. It's quite strange. I have a very different mentality if it's involved with my role. If you ask me to go down to my village hall here where I live and sort of meet 25 local neighbours, I'm a bit resistant to it sometimes. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, how that's sort of manifests itself sometimes differently in your personal life to how it represents yourself in your work life. And there's an increasing blur of that at the minute, with us being in the same space potentially for a lot of us for all of those things. I think Harvard Business Review wrote an article on effective virtual networking a little while ago, and they talked about most people not liking it, but it being a really important thing, and that kind of social contact that we're all craving. The sort of next best thing at the minute is this kind of virtual networking environment. So most people will have a dominant motivational focus for wanting to engage with networks, and psychologists will refer to that as either a promotion or a prevention mindset. So those in the former category think primarily about the growth, the achievement, the accomplishments that network can bring to them, and the others are thinking it's sort of a bit of an obligatory thing that I should do because it's part of my professional development, or I should meet more people in the sector, or I should have those conversations. I think I fluctuate between the two, probably because I'm slightly introverted, and we can't necessarily change our personalities from being introvert to extrovert, but we can potentially change our mindset from being about promotion instead of prevention. And these suggestions here are things that the Harvard Business Review was suggesting to help change that mindset to being one of promotion. So a focus on learning and a focus on thinking about what you want to get out of the event. I mean, I have to be honest, when I was in fundraising roles in-house, I used to go to lots and lots and lots of business networking events, sometimes with no intention at all. It felt like the right thing to do as a development person. And I didn't always give it the thought about what I'm going to get out of it. I think that's really, really key. Think about those common interests and what you might have with people that you can bring to the conversation. And to go further down, that kind of what you can give, I think, is really important at these times. I think networkers who are constantly on the take from people and it's not as mutually beneficial, or the reciprocity isn't there, are quite often forgotten quite quickly by people. So think about what you'll bring to the table. As it says, if your networking is driven by shared interests, it will feel more authentic. And those interests might change, and that's all right. And it might be a professional interest, it might be a personal interest, it doesn't really matter. But identifying what that is and being confident in telling people why you're engaging in this is important. And then finally, that higher purpose really, sounds quite godly, really struck a chord with me, that actually, if I'm going to an event because I think it's good for me, well, actually forget that for a minute. And whether or not I feel that I need the professional development, or whether I feel comfortable in that situation, I am very passionate about the organisation I'm representing, and the purpose of it in terms of the organisation is to help in the long term my museum thrive. It's about leveraging new partnerships, it's about sharing our expertise and positioning us. And so suddenly going with that mindset in my head to an event, it doesn't feel as awkward as me sort of tramping into the room and going, well, where's the quiet corner and where's a bit of wine? So that's just some starting points to think about in engaging with networking in a way that feels productive and positive and less terrifying, as it is to some people. And obviously there are some differences, and as I said, I think we need to consider how it's different rather than trying to fix it. So within a face-to-face situation, you've of course got the ability to relationship build in perhaps a more organic, natural way. You have the shared context of where you are, what's going on in the space around you, which is very different in the virtual world. The thing that I am missing so much from doing any face-to-face activities, the access to non-verbal cues. I didn't realise how much you sort of rely on that. And when you're doing training, we've done a lot of training in the last 6 months online, and it's sometimes really difficult to kind of sense whether people are enjoying it or not. And that's not, you have to sit with a sort of fixed frown or grin on your face, colleagues, but you know, just sort of reading the room a bit and being in a space where you can hear if one person's maybe not enjoying something as much, or has more of a question that you need to dig down into. And it's really difficult to adjust to delivery, I think, if you're not used to working in this way. And there's just that increased engagement. You know, it's sort of much easier, I think, to meet somebody at an event and be talking to them and say, oh, let's grab 10 minutes and have a quick coffee afterwards and talk through some stuff one-on-one. That feels harder to do, although it kind of shouldn't be in a virtual space because we're all sort of fixed in the same position. But I think it's something to think about whether we can replicate some of that real world, grab a coffee in a bit and transfer it into a digital space. In a virtual setting, we've obviously got the flexibility. I'm just reading Rachel's chat there about buffet. Buffet is critical, food, amazing. In a virtual space, you have that increased flexibility. Of course, people can come and go in a way that they can just sort of slip away and not be noticed, that you might in a larger space. There are unlimited numbers potentially. The multi-way communication stuff I think is really interesting, and for me, who has a kind of range of feeling confident or less confident depending on who's in the space, I think the ability to have a chat conversation and communicate in different ways, as well as a talking conversation with you all face to face, is really nice and a thing that I've really enjoyed about this time. I think also the ability to private message people within Zoom. I don't know if everybody realizes they can do that, but if you drop down the everyone button, the blue button in the chat, you can then select people individually to have conversations with that can't be seen with everybody else. And whilst it's sort of several things to focus on at the same time, I think it feels like that bit where you whisper to somebody next to you at a conference. This feels like it's right for me, and that's really interesting. And people might tut because you're making a noise around them. You don't have that same thing in the virtual world. So I think it's quite positive, and it feels like a good way of bringing in people with varying degrees of confidence in how they work. The sort of key things I think maybe to think about, and we've touched upon them all already, but I thought just having them in one place, that giving more than you get is important, and it's perhaps less of an easy thing to do than being in a space physically. Using things like chat, sharing content and information, or contributing to the conversation without having to feel like you're butting in, using that sort of functionality is quite a positive way to demonstrate what you're about, what you're interested in and why you're there, and to have quite a sort of bubbly conversation running along the side of a live event is actually a really nice thing, I think, for the trainer. I really like to see people kind of engaging with each other in the chat at the same time, unless they're saying it's horrible in a really public forum, but hats off to you. I think following up on event attendees is always a great way to do it, and I think we need to make more of a concerted effort, because we're not swapping a business card or swapping a number necessarily in these formats. If you see people talking and you're inspired by people talking in this group today, for example, give them a private message and say, that was really fascinating, I'd love to chat about that later, or have you got time for a quick coffee, a virtual coffee, to talk things through. Sort of work the room a little bit, and working the room in a practical sense is always sort of going around and getting involved in lots of conversations if you're in a face-to-face group, but working the room in a Zoom room is probably a bit different, isn't it? And I think you have to make a little bit more of a concerted effort to make sure, if you want FaceTime or airtime with a particular person who isn't facilitating the group, that you manufacture that a little bit. I think somebody said in the introductions about not neglecting their existing networks and partnerships, and I think that's really important to keep in mind, that potentially there are people that you engage with an awful lot 6 months ago in the real world that for various reasons have just not been in the same discussions online or having different formats. So think about what networks you haven't been part of very much and see if you can find out what's going on with them. You'll want them at the other end of this. I think it's much sort of much overly thought through. How do I do that? It could be an email, it could be picking up the phone, it could be looking if they've got a social media presence, just what's going on and just checking in with people. Yesterday I talked loads about the sort of context of fundraising from individuals, and I think at the moment transparency and empathy and human to human interaction is really, really valuable to people. So even if you're not approaching the partnership that you're working in or the network that you've been part of to do anything particularly, just to check in and say hi means that you're kind of keeping that alive a little bit and keeping it going. And finally, that sort of notion of contributing online, keeping the conversation going. That might be via conversations later on via email or through one-to-one conversations, or it actually might be something like sharing that you've been at an event on social media, talking about what was important to you and engaging new partners and conversations and networks through that as well. I have a sort of love-hate relationship with Twitter, in that I think it tells me everything I need to know, and I really enjoy the sort of slightly addictive quality of scrolling through it. But I do also find it's a bit of an echo chamber, isn't it? And so I find myself that the way the algorithm works, it brings more people with the same thoughts and views and shares as me into the same space. So I feel like I have to work quite hard to go outside of that algorithm and sort of find other voices and find other sounds, and sometimes I do that by changing platforms. So perhaps a conversation that I feel automatically I would share on Twitter, I might share on LinkedIn, or I might share on Facebook, or whatever social media sites you're on, just to free it up a bit. There's also a plethora of different types of networking event at the moment that we wouldn't necessarily have had access to 6 months ago. The amount of international conversations and panel things that I've been to, which were all free or very low cost, has been brilliant. I would never have gone to, like, I was a few months ago at sort of this big American philanthropy event where there were 10 big American foundations talking about their approach to funding during COVID, and it just would have been completely inaccessible. And so you can start to grow those networks and think about the access you have to them in a different way. More broadly, and I don't know if you found this, I'd be interested to hear if whether this is the case. I think people are more up for talking at the moment. I mean, don't get me wrong, we're all sick of staring at Zoom all day, but I think just the general, people are a bit more accessible than they might have been a little while ago. Particularly, I'm thinking in terms of some of the trusts and foundations, in my sort of fundraising hat on, some of the philanthropists are kind of talking more openly, some of the corporate about making decisions about who they're funding, why they're funding, what their priorities do. There are a lot more people out there looking to connect in the virtual space. And is there a way you can think about engaging with some of those people? Maybe you had a sort of top hit list of people you would have loved to have spoken to before lockdown, but would have been a sort of bit of a dream. And now it doesn't feel as difficult, perhaps. I saw a really amazing lady speaking, I was saying to Elizabeth before you joined, from New York, who's a sort of well-being coach and fundraiser, and she was brilliant. She was really inspiring, and I called her up at a huge personal cost, it turns out, to in New York to connect with us and to maybe do something on our program. And I wouldn't have reached out to international speakers 6 months ago, and it was so great to have a conversation. I mean, it didn't work out, but just it suddenly opened my mind to all the different possibilities that are available. Marina's just added a note saying, find it easier to drop someone a private message on Zoom chat to go someone in real life. Absolutely. You don't have to find that weird moment in a conversation that lulls for you to go, oh, I agree with that, which is my usual sort of jump in. And Rachel saying, webinars with US colleagues, talk about Black Lives Matter protests. Yeah, I mean, that sort of global movement and this period of time in terms of how we can and can't connect have come together really beautifully, perhaps because of coming together. But I think it's been a really interesting thing to open up the networks and think about and reflect on who you might want to speak to. So my sort of before, during and after as a bit of a summary to the notion of networking. Before you start, have a think about what your goals might be, what you want to get out of this, and bear in mind that it might be different depending on the type of network you're engaging with. It might be a personal development thing, it might be a professional development thing, it might be to do with your museum more broadly or some of your other interests. And let people know you're attending. It's really helpful if you sort of see on a social media channel, I'm attending this. You know, people do it quite a lot, and sometimes it's built into event booking software that you can automatically tweet the fact you booked a ticket and that you're coming. Search out those people. That try searching for the name of the event, or looking at the people who are hosting the event who might be sharing joiners and information before you start, so you can begin to identify who you want to speak to. You can do a little bit of old internet LinkedIn stalking and see who they are, what they're about, where they've come from. Connect with them on LinkedIn or connect with them on social and say, look, I think we're both going to the same thing. It would be great to get your thoughts on the event afterwards, or something like that. Sort of anticipate some of that conversation happening. During the event itself, so use the chat function, use ways to pass comment, whether that's in person. Sometimes it feels weird and you can't quite choose the dynamic of when you speak and how you speak on Zoom, or other platforms exist as well. But also consider whether you want to use chat, whether you want to use private messaging, whether you want to use your social media actually at the same time and be sort of live tweeting what's going on depending on the content of the session. Again, it's a great way to build up followers and people to understand who you are and get a sense of what you're about. One of the things I bang on constantly about, and yesterday was no exception, was that sort of shared value. And I think not only with fundraising, but with a lot of things in our sector. It's about finding people who share those values, whether it's audiences, funders, supporters. So anything you can do to put out in the world what your values are, or the values that you're representing for your organisation, those people will find you and be drawn to you, whether it's sort of searching for content, searching keywords that you're using, sort of reveal a little bit about your sort of institution's drive and motivation. Quite often there is there's sort of two prongs to marketing, I think, for organisations. There's the kind of event exhibition, getting people into a space, onto a Zoom call, into an event, whatever that is. And then there's the institutional marketing that people forget about, which is the personality, why they're there, who they are, what they stand for as an organisation. If you can think of ways at the moment of really pushing that message out, then those other people that share those feelings will value you, and they're partners of the future, they're project collaborators, their audiences, their funders, as I say. Set aside time. Again, it sounds like quite an obvious thing, but I think we are really at risk when we work at home a lot and work in this way and not have that much contact, of everything blurring into one. And I don't know if any of you feel it, but I find sort of end of the working day comes and I think, oh, well, I'm only in a room like once away from the living room, I'll just do a couple more emails. And suddenly it kind of blurs into this long, is it work? Is it home? What am I doing? I mean, I specifically sit in a separate space to work, and I'm fortunate to have a little corner to do that. But you need to set aside time to do what you're doing at your desk, and you don't want to be kind of trying to network and listen to a session and trying to finish an application and try to look at what you're doing out on social. Sort of figure out how you're going to approach networking, whilst it's slightly artificial, because of course one of the beauties is you can jump and quickly check on an email or not. You wouldn't necessarily do that in a real networking environment. You wouldn't necessarily be writing an application and checking your emails at the same time as you're talking to somebody. So it might mean that you need a little conscious moment to say, right, I'm in networking mode now. Who am I meeting? What am I about? What's going on? And then afterwards, that following up with new connections, and that making sure, as we've said, really, that you take the opportunity to do what you say you're going to do as a partner in, and we'll come on to this later on, of course. It's really important that you deliver what you say. So if you say to somebody in your private message, it'd be great to have a coffee, and they say yes, that would be great, make sure you get their email address and make sure you follow up, or at least give some expectation, even if it's a sort of, Joe, I'd love to touch base with you, this is really interesting, I'm absolutely flat out for a month, but can I drop you a line in November? Can I drop you a line in December? Manage their expectations and be a good networker and a good kind of partner in conversation with a view to it going somewhere else at some point. Any thoughts, comments, observations thus far about how networking might work for you? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What have you enjoyed? What have you not enjoyed? Where do you think are the sticking points for you as networkers online? That's a really interesting point. I find it the same on social media, actually, the same on Twitter, hence the kind of love-hate thing, that everybody having a comment on everything all the time can be quite challenging. And I mean, on a social media side, I've started muting people in the week that I don't want to hear from, or that I need a bit of headspace to kind of process at the weekend or whatever. And I think whilst you can't mute, as far as I'm aware, on Twitter, on Zoom chats and things, you can reflect again on why you're there and what you want to get involved in. And if that means sort of sitting back and sort of ignoring the chat a little bit until you're at a moment where you've got something to say, or you specifically want to visit that, I don't know, 10 minutes in after the conversation's changed a bit, and go back through in your own time and read it and think about it. That's one way of looking at it. Another way is to kind of lift the chat at the end and pop it into a Word document, or pop it in somewhere else where you can go back to it and then decide in your own time, you know, actually, I'm not that up for engaging with this, it's fine, or well, that's quite an interesting point, maybe I should follow up with that person. And I think you're right, people aren't always great at reflecting on the reason for the gathering in the first place. If it's a training session, or if it's a sort of educational imparting of I don't know, funding guidelines or something, it's a different kind of environment, isn't it? And it's less, you wouldn't necessarily go to that sort of thing to network. However, you might have a coffee at the break time and have a quick chat with people around the coffee machine at that point. And I think the chat is kind of the nearest equivalent you can get to that. So if I'm interested in the content and I don't really want to chat because what I'm looking for getting out of this session is X, Y, and Z, I'll close the chat altogether and just not engage with it. You have to kind of manage your own wants and needs from the space, and also the way you process information too. Because I'm the same. If there's too much going on, I can't keep track of it. And if you all started private messaging me now at the same time whilst I'm trying to talk, it would just be too much. But I would also just say there are a few messages coming at the minute, and I can't process them right now because I'm just doing this, but I'll come back to them, or making the space. It's easier to do it if you're holding the room than if you're attending. But similarly, I think there's probably something about feeling assertive enough to push back and say, can you just give me 15 minutes to listen to this, and I'll come back to you if it's being directed at you. What does everybody else think about that? How do they cope with all the sound and noise everywhere?
I found I've been more strategic with choosing which events to go to. At the beginning of the lockdown, there was a lot of stuff. Certain networks having weekly coffee chats and things, but I've stopped going to some of those, even though I've had vested interest in those networks, just trying to cut down because it just becomes a bit noisy. And to be strategic, saying what do I want to get out of this session, or who do I like to meet, or to have contact with.
I think, yeah, it's the same, isn't it? If you go onto Eventbrite and just search networks near me or whatever, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of sessions, and you could spend your entire day, week, month going to different stuff. And you're right, Elizabeth, I think there was a bit of that at the start, wasn't there, of everybody desperately feeling the need to be in a space digitally engaging. But your time is really precious, and even if it feels like it blurs a little bit into evenings and mornings and weekends, and it shouldn't do, you need to restrict kind of how much you, as you would in your day job, because you wouldn't necessarily, unless you've got a very specific job, spend your whole time at events doing that particular thing, you know. Yvette, hello.
Just because one of the things that I find when you're networking we were networking in the old-fashioned way, was the unexpected. You know, it was kind of, you'd have conversations that would spark something that you really hadn't thought of at all. Whereas it seems to me, and I don't know whether this is other people's experience too, that doing it online, you have to be a little bit more focused. You have to have a sort of purpose in mind more than you do when you're chatting with somebody over a coffee or a bacon sandwich or getting stuck in your teeth type of event, you know.
Yeah. I think that's very true, and that's one of the things that it's not easy, if at all possible, to replicate. Those sort of the coffee moments, as I call them, are much harder, if not impossible, to recreate. There are platforms. Has anybody heard of Hopin? Is a event platform. It's aimed at kind of larger scale kind of conferences, big numbers of people, but they've got a really nice networking bit of that where you can opt to go into it as an attendee, and you're just virtually matched with somebody for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever it is, to have a chin wag, and then it moves you on. And it's sort of trying to recreate that bumping into people at conferences. I mean, the thought of that slightly terrifies me if you've got a big conference of 1,000 people, but some people will want to have that kind of, who am I going to meet now, and jump into that space. And if you're hosting events on it, you can also sort of tailor who meets who by ticket types and things like that. So if you were having an event where you were bringing policymakers and professionals from museum sector and funders of museums, you can make sure one of each of those went into little groups of 3. So the larger conferencey type replications that are moving online are trying to manage that. In Zoom, I mean, you can do it with breakout rooms. Have people done breakout rooms in Zoom spaces, which are quite nice, just to have a sort of different size group of people on the screen and to have some conversation away from the main group. And if you're running an event yourself and you want to kind of convene some of that quieter conversation with less noise actually in from the big public space, consider using breakout rooms as a way to do that. And you can either, if you haven't used them before, you can either have them automatically split people off at will, or you can choose which people go into which groups. It's available on the sort of one up from the basic membership of Zoom as a function. You turn it on in the settings. I think that's Right, and again, going back to that first thing I said about the sort of motivation for people networking, there are probably less instances, although I might be wrong, in our sector where we go specifically to network and meet new people. It's usually driven by learning something or buying something or selling something. And so, I mean, it might be, if that's something you crave, and kind of meeting those people and having those quieter conversations, either looking out for specifically for things that are around networking and starting new conversations. I see them on Twitter quite a lot, where people will say, is anybody up for a coffee to talk about this? And some people start to comment and people start to get involved, and that's quite a nice way into a new group of people, though it can be a bit scary. And the other thing, I suppose, is the sort of the bodies that support the sector. I'm not entirely sure if AIM and the Museums Association or the Museum Development Networks, actually, Elizabeth, you can share here if you're doing any of that sort of event. I know the Institute Fundraising is, the Arts Marketing Association are, where they're specifically coming together to chat in smaller groups as opposed to much bigger.
We do have regional networks. In fact, would you like to sub-regional networks?
Yeah, we do. So there are some that are working very effectively during this period, the West London Museums Group, but they tend to have an element of training involved in their networking meetings, and those are going very well. The smaller groups, the South and East Museums Group that I'm involved in, we've had a couple of sort of coffee morning style events, but the turnout hasn't been huge. But clearly people do enjoy the opportunity of talking about what they're doing and some of the problems that they're facing with other people. So we'll continue to do those. And I think it's a, you know, as you say, the sort of human contact, having a chance to sort of, you know, just voice what's happening to you and air that in a forum with like-minded people is helpful.
I think the smaller groups as well are important, because no matter how well you say, you know, it's Chatham House rules, everything will stay confidential, in a group with 150, 200 people in, that's really difficult to feel very secure in talking about anything a bit private. And for some reason, a smaller group, regardless of whether you know them or not, actually, it just feels, I think, when you can see everybody on the screen, seems to be the good limit for me in terms of feeling like I can share stuff that perhaps is a bit more sensitive. In ones where you're having to scroll through to see everybody's face. The other thing with networks, I suppose, is the opportunity to use this as a moment to start your own, if you had the capacity, interest. The resource we can help with, we give out networks funding of up to £2,000 to individuals or organisations that want to start a new network. And I can put the address into the chat of what to follow if you'll be interested in applying for that. So we can cover the cost of it. But it might be that you say, do you know what, we've had all these amazing, interesting opportunities to meet international speakers and hear about different kinds of reference points for what we do and what we're interested in. Maybe I want to bring some close colleagues and partners together into a space and just unpick some of that and what it means for us and to help contextualize it. So you might want to run that sort of thing and create your own network if you've got the space. Okay. I'm going to sort of move on slightly into partnership working. And obviously that's such a broad topic, isn't it? And partnerships can do all sorts of things and mean all sorts of things to different people. You may be familiar with this Zambian proverb, which I really like, on the nature of your relationships. And I think it can feel, in partnership, particularly if you're used to kind of quite regular face-to-face contact with partners and you suddenly don't have that, it can feel like it's taking forever, can't it, to establish a working practice that fits for everybody, or are you kind of drifting around and you're not quite sure where you're going with it? I mean, essentially a partnership to me is an ongoing relationship with shared risk, right? So that's in its simplest form. And it's not always the fastest moving thing, but I think what I want to unpick a little bit over this session is sort of why it's good to work in partnership, why it's advantageous, and why it's worth slogging away at it in a sort of digital space, even though it might feel just completely ridiculous at the moment and quite challenging, whether that's new or not. But in order to do that effectively, I would like to know what you are doing. How are you currently working in partnership? How have you formed any new partnerships at all during COVID? And that can be something very, very little. So I'm on the board of a gallery in Ely in Cambridgeshire, and we've formed a little tiny informal partnership with Ely Stained Glass Museum, where the curator of that museum is going to start sitting on virtual interview panels for volunteer roles, and we're doing the same with them. And that's it. It's very light touch, but it started out in lockdown as a way of kind of having a different voice on a panel. It's mutually beneficial. It's hopefully the start of a kind of emerging relationship of working a little bit more closely with that museum. I think that some of that is also based upon how well you do or don't know your partners, and the heritage project that I just mentioned that we've started. So we've worked with the Arts Marketing Association for a number of years, and we know each other really well, and we sort of don't necessarily need the same nuances in if we're in a meeting face to face, because it's quite easy to do virtual things and make agreements. Creative United, we haven't worked with before, and as my role in leading that partnership, I often have to think, you know, we don't have the sort of shared language or shared understanding of each other's work in the way that I do with the AMA. And I have to check myself and spend sort of more time explaining things that perhaps I wouldn't, or skimmed over things, and just growing that kind of who you are and what you do. I've been trying to go to some of their events and just see how they work as an organisation. I've been trying to look at other things that they partner with other people on and see the sort of projects they get involved in, which all might be something that you could ask them in a sort of simple conversation in real life, but it just seems quite forced to then pull them together and say, well, what else do you do exactly? And it's maintaining, hopefully, to them, showing that I'm really interested in their organisation, and this is a kind of long-term sustainable thing that we want to develop. And I think that pastoral element of the role of support that partners play to each other is something that you have to work a bit harder on when it's virtual. We run a fellowship program for 10 individuals across the country every year, and they've been entirely digital this year, and normally they've done residentials by now and they're all kind of chatting all the time, and we've had to put in extra things, like there is a sort of regular book club. They have reading to do every month, and normally I would just say we'll read it and then when we catch up next we'll talk about it, but we actually bring everyone together once a month to talk through the reading and have a think about stuff, in a bid to kind of keep some of that more informal, non-curriculum based stuff, or non-deliverable based stuff ticking over. And the other thing we use is a tool which is called 15-5, 1-5 the number and then the word 5. That's a continuous performance management software, and we actually use it as Course 4, which is within our team, but we've adapted it to use it for this partnership of 10 fellows. And what the idea is that they spend 15 minutes a week sort of summarising what's happened, what they think, what's going on. They give it their week a little rating out of 1 to 5, and we particularly pose some questions, sort of anything you feel unclear about or anything we can help with. And they submit that, and then I spend 5 minutes, the 5 bit of the 15-5, reviewing that. What that does really effectively is give a pulse of how that partnership feels. So it averages out for you kind of everybody's score between 1 and 5. And I get a little track of sort of how the group's feeling as a whole. And I found that immensely useful. I mean, as I say, it's designed for teams really, and we do it as a team at Course 4. But that sort of regular tracking, there is a charge for it. I think there is a free version of it actually, which has some less functionality. But it was certainly a worthwhile investment, I think, for that programme, just in terms of keeping track. And you know, I think addressing some of those things that if you had a kind of weekly meeting for the project or a monthly meeting, little niggles and things would come up anyway and you could unpick them, but we're not having that at the moment. So this gives people a kind of a space where they're filling in a form, so perhaps they also feel a little bit more honest and brutal than they might be if they're face to face, but they're sharing just little snippets of information that help me think, well, how can I adapt this? What needs to happen next? It's really helpful. I think that informal starting point is really nice, and something that you can capitalise on and build on. And it says a great thing about, I think, those sort of shared values and shared understanding of what you're about, which goes a long way. there's a power imbalance, and whether, particularly if you're kind of partnering with an organisation that's a lot bigger than you, sometimes it feels like there's a real imbalance there, and it's important to be clear about what you're bringing to the table, regardless of the scale of your organisation or your turnover or anything else. I think the transparency, which goes with the communication point that Camilla made about how you're effectively getting across what you're about and what you're doing. And then also, I think sometimes somebody needs to win in a partnership, and it sometimes feels that kind of regardless of how you should be working together, somebody feels like they need to be getting a bit more out of it. And that's, again, sometimes without having the kind of nuance of passive aggressive verbal cues, non-verbal cues in real life. People are quite explicit about that in online forums, I'm finding, so what they want to get out of something, and it shows their colours in quite an interesting way. There was an academic in America that wrote about successful and unsuccessful leaders of things, and he said it's that desire to win, regardless of whether the winning matters or not to the project, that many initially successful people struggle with. And the interactions we have with many of our relationships are not entirely transactional. You know, so in a debate setting, you argue with somebody for 45 minutes, or you just shout at each other if you're in the States, apparently, and you win or you lose, and then you move on. But with personal and work relationships, they're much more nuanced than that, and there is more to just coming together for something transactional in a successful partnership, in my opinion. It's about working together and collaborating longer term. And with that in mind, I think just some sort of thoughts around the three main values when you're thinking about partnerships, which are equity, transparency, as we've said, and mutual benefit, because over time those things become these things: respect, trust, and engagement. And I think the trust and engagement is perhaps easier to ascertain in this virtual space than the equity becoming respect, because you're not kind of aware of the context necessarily in the same way when you're all over the place engaging online or on the phone, or you don't have perhaps the same regularity and frequency of meetings. So there's something to think about there when you're emphasizing new partnerships. What elements are important to you, what elements you know you're going to struggle with, because your organization as well has a culture associated with it, and that culture, whatever it is, will impede or support you growing new relationships. So understanding what others think about you coming into it, not you personally, but you as an organization coming into a partnership, is really important to think about. And thinking about culture a little bit, we will do after a bit of a break, but I was just trying to think of some of the personal challenges that you might have coming into spaces. So are you operating at the moment in an echo chamber because you're sticking to people you know, you're not reaching new people necessarily? So think about how you'd like to talk to, who you'd like to have new conversations with, or perhaps emerging partnerships with, and think about how you can engage them with what you do, whether that's inviting them to something, whether it's reaching out to them and just trying to find the space to have a coffee, whether it's seeing what else they're talking about on their kind of marketing and social media channels. What are they doing? What values do they have? And how are you aligned with yours? Can you take advantage of the space to be reflective? Although it feels like I haven't been reflective for months, because it's just been one thing after the other, hasn't it? But in theory, we should be able to carve out a little bit of this different time to think about things a bit differently. And I was saying yesterday, your plan might not necessarily need to be a new plan for what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve, either in a partnership or as an organisation, but it might just need to happen in a different order. You might need to move things forward, you might need to push back reporting, you might need to think about the points that you need finance injected into your partnership at different times. So don't panic and throw the baby out with the bathwater with your project plans and your partnership plans, because actually you've done all that thinking already. It's just fitting it into this new context. And I think the opportunity to be ambitious and be radical is something that I think people are having more, or sort of louder and broader ideas and conversations at the minute. It feels a safer time to do that because it's all up in the air, isn't it? I mean, our little gallery did a drive-in cinema in a massive business park in Ely for 500 cars a few weeks ago. And if you'd have said in a meeting 6 months ago, we're going to do this huge drive-in cinema with some new partners, and we're going to have it screened for 500 people blasting out Grease across the city, I would have thought you were absolutely ridiculous. But suddenly that seems like quite a normal conversation. Yeah, we could probably all think about that. So use it as an opportunity to be ambitious and drive your ideas behind the partnership. And that includes celebrating the failures as well as successes. And there's a lot of stuff online at the moment about sort of acknowledging failure. In my old job, our chief exec used to run a festival of failure every 3 months where we all had to come as a team and present something back that hadn't gone very well and what we'd learned from it. And it was hugely valuable, of course it is. But what I think the risk of needing to put output all the time, and the last 6 months has made it feel like, but we need to be doing something, we need to be seen, we need to be bringing in money, we need to be fundraising, we need to be talking about everything. Have a moment to just think, well, what hasn't worked? What have we learned? Let's work through that. Take a breath and then revisit your approach or your strategy for whatever it is you're building. And finally, that expectation management thing. Are you able to take away something and move it forwards? If you're having a new partnership conversation and you know that everybody's workloads in your organisation are absolutely sky high at the minute because you've got less people involved or you've got different people doing different things, just make sure you're honest and transparent about that with people. I can move this forward, but I can't do it for 4 weeks, or I can do this now, but it's going to be a bigger bit of work in a month's time, or whatever, and just make sure everybody's clear and on the same page. What are your thoughts on the differences between partnership and collaboration? I just wanted to end with 3 very commercial examples of long-term partnerships, which I think highlights some of the things we've talked about already, and will also frame the next part of our conversation in terms of how we're effectively managing these partnerships and how we're making them work. Disney and Pixar, left field, they got together in 1997 now and had a long sort of 10-year deal. Equal footing, very, very clear communication with each other, a very clear sense of shared vision, mission, audience, really, really, really demonstrable areas to work together and collaborate. Their 5 films initially after that partnership got $2.5 billion on average at the box office, highest grossing films in the industry. That partnership has since actually gone bad, and it's quite interesting to read in more recent times why that went off track. And I think their idea about growing and maintaining and keeping a strategic alliance together fell off a little bit later on, but initially it was cartoon heaven, as I say. Benz and Chrysler, so these were 2 car manufacturers that came together, and the synergies that were identified as part of that initial deal that they had with each other were never quite realised. And I think largely because they just didn't really like each other as organisations. On one hand, you had the kind of mid-market offer in Detroit, and the other one being a sort of high-end market brand in Stuttgart. And there was a really, really clear rationale on paper for them working together. They had different senses of the market, the segmentation made sense. There were cost efficiencies in production centrally, and that sort of economies of scale that you get in working in partnership. But it just didn't work. There wasn't trust. One didn't want to talk about the other, one didn't want to talk to the other, and ultimately they ended up selling it for 1/5 of the initial price, which was a loss of 30 billion for that relationship. And then finally, if you want really horrendous partnership, Quaker Oats and Snapple. I don't know if anybody remembers Snapple. That just says it all, does it? So Quaker managed a brand of drink called Gatorade at one point, and they thought it was the sort of the market that Snapple, the drink, should be going for. So they purchased Snapple as the brand for £1.7 billion, which was estimated as £1 billion too much by Wall Street, which I thought was quite interesting, which they were so excited. 27 months later, they sold it for 300 million, so it lost them 1.6 million per day of owning that relationship and that partnership. And what they thought was that they would leverage all the relationships through the large retail chains and the networks that Gatorade had and Quaker had, and they would push Snapple into that. But actually, the market and the audience for that particular drink were ones that were buying it through gas stations and bodegas and corner stores and tiny shops. And so it just didn't work. The resulting marketing campaign about the partnership just didn't translate across. And in the meantime, their competitors, i.e. a small company called Coca-Cola, launched some new products which completely demolished the market and just ate away, and they'd missed their opportunity. And I think the lessons we can learn from those all three of those, I mean, whilst they're big commercial examples, are things that you can read across into your own work. And some of them are more brand oriented and how brands align, and Saskia's bag certainly, and what she was just talking about in terms of how brands collaborate and work together or go against each other. There's something about the importance of shared value and vision, which Disney and Pixar did really well. There's something about turning shared value and vision into something practical and deliverable, which Benz and Chrysler started doing and then messed up. And then there's just being so excited about the potential and not listening to warnings when you're buying something or investing £1 billion too much into something because you're floating away on an idea and it's not grounded in reality. My experience is that the limited brand stuff that I've been involved with, people have been quite sort of cautious about the word brand, not so much in the museum sector, but in the arts and culture space more broadly. I think there is a desire to work in that way, but I think there's quite a lot of culture in the sort of little c rather than to think about in terms of how people perceive that within the sector. But yes, I mean, there's a very obvious read through for me in terms of an opportunity to create money there. But I think it depends on your organisation, it depends on your stakeholders, it depends on your funders to some respect potentially, and possibly the nature of your collections or how they sit if you're in a museum space. I think it's a new area actually for organisations to think about, and to be done in a way that you can kind of sell it into trustees. The value of culture is I think the sort of capital it holds is growing at the moment. There's been a bit of a surge of people wanting to save things, be interested in things, support things. There's the government investment into it. There's a lot of people shouting out about how important it is. It's a really good time to kind of ride that wave if you're starting to think about that work, I'd have thought. Fantastic. So what does best practice look like in terms of partnership working at the moment? And what are the kind of things we need to think about and how it will be different to real world partnerships perhaps? Key, and we've touched on this already really, is about understanding the purpose of that partnership, why you're doing it in the first place and what's being brought to the table by everybody. Understanding the shared and the individual liability and the risks associated with that partnership. And culture, I think, is, as I've said before, is a really key part of why partnerships either work really well or don't work really well. Sometimes cultures of organisations can feel very, very different, but they do work because there's an understanding and a kind of respect for those different cultures or different approaches to things. And sometimes it can be a nightmare, as I'm sure you all know. The University of Leeds, who we partner with on our Arts Fundraising and Philanthropy programme, are obviously a big, huge academic institution, and they move at a very different speed. And their sort of bureaucracy in terms of how they pay things and when they pay things and who sorts out what and says yes to what makes it a different sort of way of working to perhaps ourselves as Cause 4 in the Arts Marketing Association that are a similar scale and move at a similar speed to things. That's fine, and it works really well for us because we're all aware of the steps it takes to process an invoice or get a course signed off, and so we work around our timelines to make sure that that doesn't become problematic. I don't know if anybody is working with a higher education body at all, but they're notoriously sort of complex structures to navigate through. And the key points, I think, is sort of establishing that trust between parties, having a clear focus, as I've said, on the best outcome for the beneficiaries or the result of the project, whatever that is, and recognising where there could be challenges along the line. I think there is a huge amount of learning to be had from just reviewing other people's experiences of partnership, and which is why I've really tried to draw out some of this conversation today, because theoretically it's very simple to put on paper, have somebody who agrees with what you think, agree to what you're going to do, and agree to address it if something goes wrong. But actually in reality there's all sorts of other things, from cats and dogs running around in Zoom calls to world pandemics that can hamper what should be really relatively straightforward. First of all, I mean, what do you need in a partnership? And I think partners that have a genuine acknowledgement of what they're bringing or what they're not bringing and what they're looking for tend to work much better together. I think if you're building a partnership around something in a sort of single space, like we want to attract funding, therefore we're going to start partnering with this person, often isn't the best approach. It often, I'm sure you've been in situations before where you've kind of suddenly got yourself together for a deadline, found someone that you don't know that well, do you mind me name checking you in the application, off it goes, and suddenly you're embroiled in this funding relationship to deliver something with somebody that you don't really know. And I think these are just a few things that I thought might have some areas that you might think about in terms of what you want from partners and what you think about partners. And there are ways to find that at the moment in a more challenging format, but certainly you can, much like looking for funding actually, sort of identifying other partnerships or other projects that have a similar feel to what you want to create and identifying who's working on those. There's working on word of mouth and your contacts and your networks, and you're having those conversations about who's good to work with, what sort of things are they interested in at the moment, what are you interested in. There's something about putting yourself out there and being very explicit with what you have to bring to that partnership. And as I say, identifying things, you know, we don't have the specific technical knowledge in this type of work. That's why we're seeking new partners. It might be we have a very defined vision of what we want to achieve. And the way that we're going to do that is by working with similar people. So how do organizations demonstrate their vision and their mission and values? Is it by that, as I said, that institutional marketing, what you talk about, what you consider to be putting out into the world, not just in there's this many events happening, but what you're saying actually, where are organizations commenting on things that you're interested in? Are you reading blogs or thought pieces that reference those organizations? Are they putting out content that is appealing to you and relates to what you want to partner on? Is there an identified lack of something that you've come across in other relationships and other partnerships that you've had? You know, we've never had the quite the right evaluation partner. We've never been able to demonstrate the impact of what we're doing. And does that little seed of learning from your previous track record of working in partnership mean that it sort of influences how you might go to find something now? Searching a little bit of desk-based research, which is where we're all confined to mostly at the minute in terms of keywords, in terms of key themes. Who else is operating in this sphere? Who are they working with? Why are they working with things? Are there funders that are funding bits of work or partnership that's the type of partnership you're interested in developing? Going into the Charity Commission's website and looking at that funder's accounts and seeing who they're funding might lead you into some new relationships and some new individual organisations that you haven't come across before. And who are the gatekeepers? Sometimes I think in everybody's networks there are some gatekeepers, aren't there? There's sort of a person or a position or a body that supports you perhaps that just seems to know lots of people and has their finger on the pulse of what's going on. Can you get some face time with them to talk about what you're looking to achieve, and can you find people to help signpost you? Can you task certain people? Sometimes board members, for example, are great at opening doors to new conversations and new faces. So are the board aware and engaged with what you're doing, and are you trying to bring them along with you in the journey in terms of finding and scoping somebody new? Really, there's a lot of risk, I think, that you have that preconception of what organizations might be like without really knowing them. So if you don't know an organization, as I've just terribly stereotyped the entire higher education system as being bureaucratic and quite slow moving, you can apply. It can be really easy, particularly now when you're quite isolated, to apply kind of misconceptions or preconceptions of what those types of organisation are like to work with before you approach them. So if you can, try and look through that, try and see if you can engage with them on a sort of non-committal, it'd be good to meet you, have a look at the sort of communication they're putting out, see if you know anyone else who's worked with them before in your network to get a sense of that, so you're not kind of pushing things through. This is from a Countryside Alliance document about building effective partnerships and talking about exactly that the challenge of stereotypes to do with certain organizations. And I think it's quite interesting that how they've put certain things that having worked in the public sector, I had many of those things going to do a maternity cover job at a local authority, and I was convinced I was going to be working in a very grey team that was very miserable and slow moving and not really happy in their life. Actually, I found a wonderfully engaged organisation that I absolutely loved working for, and was very sad that the maternity leave came to an end and off I went. But I think there was something in sort of considering this. And also, what do you think your stakeholders and your peers and the people who don't know you even, what are the misconceptions that they might have about working with the museum sector on something? So if you're having those cross-sectoral partnerships, what do you think other people are saying about our sector, your sector? What do you think, how do you kind of get a sense of an organisation's culture then if you can't visit it and you can't talk to it? How do you get a feel for new potential partners in your role at the moment, or how would you go about doing that? I find it personally, perhaps it's, and this was the same before lockdown as well, but I find I have better conversations when I'm scoping things out on the phone than I do via email. I mean, it's a pretty standard thing, isn't it? But it's worth bearing in mind, because the default now is to go, oh, I'll send you a Zoom link, or oh, we'll set this up. Sometimes phone calls are still really good for stuff. And I think people feel secure talking in a different way, even if it's one-to-one Zoom call. It's sometimes quite useful and really refreshing, I have to say, after loads of Zoom calls, to just have a nice regular phone call with people. Marvellous. When you're thinking about what a good partner is for you, you might want to start to consider some of these areas. You know, do they have a good track record? Do they have a good standing, which you're gauging from those interactions with people? Perhaps you're looking for somebody who has or some organisation that has wide-ranging contacts, or the influence that you need to move something across or get something through, or perhaps the sort of longer-term strategic ambition for the piece of work that you're doing is to be an advocacy tool or to lobby, and you're looking for partners with that sort of contact base. As we've said, it might be skills and competencies, and not just skills and competencies that are coming to you and filling gaps within your own organisation, but perhaps other partners that you've already got on board as well. So it's important to read across that it's not just potentially a dynamic between you and one other, it might be you and several others, and then therefore a kind of joint approach to what's missing, and mapping and gapping is a good place to start. And it's something that can be contributed to in a sort of a fairly light touch way, potentially a sort of skills audit, or if you're in early days of a project emerging, you might have a sort of shared Google Doc that you can be adding thoughts to and things to and working on together collaboratively as time goes by. And then security, I suppose, you want as well, which is a little bit harder to ascertain because organisations are being perhaps a little less vocal, understandably, if they're in trouble. But security in terms of kind of sound management, but security in terms of financial stability, if anybody has that anymore, and financial long-term planning. And again, I think that looks a little bit at benchmarking some partners against each other. If they're charitable bodies, having a look at their accounts and reading through sort of how they've been doing over the last few years. If there's any particular flags, and if you're at the point of having a conversation with them, I mean, I think it's reasonable to raise that as a sort of initial conversation with people. You know, this is a 5-year project ideally that we want to do. Are you feeling kind of stable in terms of how you're delivering? How are we building a partnership to have break clauses or exit points? And it feels a bit defeatist to start talking about the end of the project at the beginning, but I think it's really important that you map out those moments that you can consider whether this is still the right direction of travel with the same group of people, because things change. I mean, look at this year. And also whether or not the project does have an end date, or the partnership does have an end date. I think most partnerships usually do, to some extent. I mean, a number of ours are driven by funding arrangements, and we would work together anyway, but the sort of key moments we collaborate are based on 4-year funding cycles. So it's got a firm end date anyway, but if it wasn't based on that, we would still be looking to understand how we get out of it. I think it's a bit like being on a board sometimes. You get involved in it and then you're desperate to leave, but it doesn't feel quite right and you don't know how, and it all becomes quite awkward for a little while until you realise your way out of it. So making that really simplistic and straightforward adds to that nature of transparency, I think. And deciding how to partner on that, and sort of how formally to put something together, I think is something that needs to be worked through. But you've got kind of varying degrees of formality in terms of how you might administer that partnership, whether that's verbally and sort of informally with no real documents, but you've said you'll work together. So my example of sitting on each other's recruitment panels at Stained Glass Museum in Ely, there wasn't any contract to do with that. It was just quite light touch. The more formal memorandum of agreement or understanding, and then the most formal partnership agreement or joint venture arrangement. Putting those together, there are lots and lots of templates online. There are lots of ways to approach it. Because you're not meeting people face to face, potentially, there is a risk of sort of going off and commenting on it and preparing it separately and then coming back together with a merged document. I think it's much easier to talk through some of these things in a Zoom setting, in a face-to-face conversation, so you can work things through and that things aren't left to be misinterpreted because it's only the written word. So just keeping those moments in your project plans and in your partnership plans where you're coming together to discuss specific bits of writing or how things could be misinterpreted and how things could be pulled through. Also check your funding arrangements. If you have a funding arrangement which brings a partnership together, they may require a certain degree of formality. For example, both of our main programs require partnership agreement at kind of the most formal end of administration. So it's just worth checking whether there are any other constraints elsewhere that are dictating how you might choose to administer something. And with regards to sort of best practice in what goes into a partnership agreement, these would be the usual elements in my experience, sort of goals and expectations, the roles that you have, a work plan, an understanding about finance and resource contribution. So you're not, particularly again, if people are bringing different types of things to the table, making it very clear that everybody understands what that is. And ideally, I think, although I'm interested in your thoughts, that every other partner understands what everyone else is bringing to the table as well. So it feels very collaborative and it feels very joined up. Whether there's any fundraising or additional investment or income to generate as part of that partnership and where those responsibilities sit. Comms, who's saying what? Who, if you get into one of these horrible Twitter wars that I see going on, whose role is it to step in? Are you not going to step in? What's your approach to crises in its global sense, but in a sort of local PR sense as well? The decision-making structure, which again I think is perhaps obvious stuff, but it's worth reiterating just for the purposes of this slide. What happens if something goes wrong? Where does it escalate to? Who agrees something? What is the framework that you use to get in and out of this partnership? Can other partners ask people to leave? Is there a point that you bring in a facilitator or a mediator, all the worst case scenario stuff? And to what extent does the cost of that sit with the partnership? Lots of things to think through in terms of making those difficult bits easier. And it's much easier, of course, to have all these conversations while you're excited and still speaking to each other than figuring it out in retrospect if something goes wrong. And then finally, as I'd said before, that kind of exit strategy. Is there an initial term of partnership that you're looking at? Is that linked to a project that you're doing? Is it linked to a piece of funding? Is it just an appropriate amount of time to say, let's have a pause here and just reflect and consider what's working for us and what's not? And to make that equitable across the different partners. Does anybody have any sort of observations or questions in terms of how the mechanics of that partnership and finding new partners might work at the moment? I mean, I think the warmer you can be to the company because of a mutual contact or a connection is a really great way in. You want to get in front of a decision maker. You want to have a sort of, if it's a very hierarchical structure, sort of as high up that chain as possible. And if you've got assets at your disposal to help you get to those, then that's brilliant. I do think at the moment, again, this sort of openness and ease of access to people, which this pandemic seems to be presenting to us, means I'm aware of people who've just been reaching out on social media to people, LinkedIn and DMs, direct messages on Twitter, and just saying, hello, I'd love to talk to you about this. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it feels like I'm hearing more of it working than I used to 12 months ago. I think identifying who in the organisation is interested in what you're talking about is important as well. So whereas actually it might be the director of marketing that you think it's going to go to, but if it's a sort of fundraising initiative, actually the director of fundraising is the right way in, and identifying who they are and being a bit specific. And then finally, the understanding if there's a sort of multi-prong approach so it doesn't get messy. So if you're sending off a trustee or a colleague or to go and find somebody that they think they know and connect in with, and you're going the other way, just making sure you keep in contact with each other, because it can look a bit weird when you get several conversations going about the same bit of work. I had a really embarrassing situation where I was trying to get a patron for a fundraising campaign I was doing, and it was Jude Law, who ended up being a patron for this campaign. And I chased his agent and chased his agent, and she was there to protect him from people like me haranguing him all the time. At the same time, I had a conversation with a local head teachers network, because he'd gone to school locally to the organisation, and the head teacher contacted him directly and said, "Do you want to be involved?" He said, "Of course I would." And then for 6 months, the agent hated me and made my life as difficult as possible, because to her, I'd gone above her head, and that wasn't the intention at all. But I didn't keep in contact enough with the head teacher from just sort of mentioning it off the cuff to him. So I learnt my lesson. I think Jude Law still liked us, but the agent didn't. That's for sure. Anyone else, or any sort of thoughts on getting an in to organisations if you don't know them? Mutual friends and sort of the 6 degree of separation thing I mentioned yesterday, for those who were there, is also, is a good way. Is like, identify the organisations you want to work with, tell your network, whether that's your board, your colleagues, your staff, your friends, these are the 6 organisations I want to work with. How do I reach them in 6 steps? And you'd be surprised how effective that can be if you define your sort of end goal. And quite often, if people aren't asked for specific people, they find it harder to rationalise that, okay, well, who can help you with this? But by being said, I want to speak to Mrs. Jones from this company, it's a much easier, tangible thing for people to support with. I did some work with an organisation a couple of years ago. We were identifying people who had the propensity to give them sort of substantial chunks of money. And we went through the board and we did this, and we sort of identified these people through a process of talking through who was sort of high net worth individuals in the area. And then the chair of the board just went, "Oh, well, I would just call them, I'd call them, and I'd call them." Like, well, why haven't you done that already? And well, nobody ever really identified that those were the people they wanted her to make contact with. So it had never happened. And it was only a very small organisation. It makes me smile every time I think about it. And they've since gone a really long way in kind of engaging networks and engaging conversations on the back of that. So I think the other thing I just wanted to raise in these last few slides was, I think when you approach somebody, if you're approaching them out of the blue and cold as well, sometimes there can be that kind of, is this the competition air rather than is this a collaborator? And you want to kind of mitigate that a little bit. Competition is sometimes quite good in the world, I think, and not always. The competition and collaboration can work together quite effectively. I think in terms of, this is something from the Cass Business School, wrote a paper about sort of harnessing, organisations harnessing the positive elements of competition and addressing the negatives of that. And I think where you can work with organisations that truly, I'm sorry, I got blinded here, truly deliver benefits to both parties, understand what's the driving force between individual organisations' direction of travel and strategy, and what's moving things on. So competition can help foster innovation, because you're constantly trying to redevelop something or to create something new and exciting. It discourages you from thinking too much, because you have to move quite quickly if you've got another partnership competing with you for something, or another organisation. And then there's something motivational sometimes, if it's managed well, about competition. Then similarly with collaboration on that side, there's the efficiency, of course, of working with people. And the collective impact of what you do can be really powerful, particularly for funders. Sort of defining that collective impact of you working together as opposed to just singly can be really, really powerful in terms of generating future investment and understanding why you're part of that collaboration or partnership. What is it that the partnership's bringing that you couldn't do as an individual entity, as an individual organisation, is important to keep in mind. And then just to sort of to stress that, this is from Hilary Crowley, who works for the Urban Strategies Council in the US. And I think it's just a really nice sort of summary of things to think about when you're bringing together different relationships and how they might perceive you. this sort of context and this theory, as I say, that we've talked about, what does that mean for change development with things that we've identified today and the risks that we've identified and the ways of working differently that we've identified? What does it mean for you guys in terms of change or development, or how might you have to do things differently to move things forward? What are the key elements in your own context and the way you're operating to building those effective partnerships? And are there any challenges prohibiting that at the moment? Is it the way that you're perceived? Is it your positioning? Is it your profile is very much shouting about one thing and people don't realize that you're an expert in something else? Is it that you need to kind of diversify how you talk about what you do? Just some things to throw out there, but I'm quite interested in sort of how you now move forwards, having reflected on some of this stuff today.
I wondered if it was just worth me saying I went to an event yesterday, another online event at the London Culture Forum, and it was Moira Sinclair from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation was giving a talk, and she was being interviewed actually. And one of the questions that they asked her was, you know, how did she see things moving forward? And it was really interesting because she said that because of COVID, obviously it's exposed a lot of inequalities. And she saw that as being a really key thing for everyone to think about in terms of applications to organisations like Paul Hamlyn going forward. So health, poverty, race, all of those things. But she also did say very strongly she thinks that going forward, collaborations and partnerships are going to be increasingly important. And she thinks that it's quite likely that they will be funding a lot more and looking for more successful partnerships of that kind. So just a timely bit of context to add, I think.
I agree, and there was a trend before COVID of trusts and foundations liking to fund partnership work, but as the value of their own investments are decreasing and they've got less money to give out for the next 18, 24 months potentially to make their impact and to achieve what they need to achieve as a charitable body, they're going to need to fund partnerships in that way. And I think that's also a really interesting thing to think about, that not knee-jerk reacting to saying, right, I must form a partnership now with the first people I see, to giving really considered thought to who you're going to spend your precious resource and time cultivating to growing this wonderful approach to something. And because it's those authentic partnerships that will be invested in, because you can see a mile off if someone's quickly switched a signature into a partnership agreement at the last minute to leverage some funding. Any thoughts from anyone else? What do you think are the challenges with your organisations at the moment that either prohibit or encourage good partnership working? Well, I think there are two things there. That one is that, I mean, the pandemic has exposed the fragility of all of our organisations in this sector to some extent, hasn't it? And I think there is at least a kind of level playing field, in that the people you're talking to are probably also feeling that. There will be some that will see Museum of London and think, fantastic, they must have loads of reserves, and I'll drift that way. But there'll be others that will appreciate that, and I would argue that that kind of sort of relationship with you probably isn't the relationship you want to pursue at the minute anyway. But there'll be people who recognise that fragility, and also in terms of starting these conversations off, I think because we've got this shared experience of going through this, people are expecting you to say, we haven't got much money at the minute, so how can we make this work? And it's actually creating really exciting creative opportunities, because people are going to have to, if they want to get this stuff done, they're having to work through it in complicated, more challenging ways. And having funders in those conversations, the funders are really open to doing that at the moment, in my experience. Have those conversations with people who might support some of that thinking and some of that work, and bring them into part of the conversation with you.